On October 4th, 1993, the democratically elected Russian President Boris Yeltsin ordered tanks to fire on his own parliament building, live on national television. Let's rewind a few years, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Out of the chaos, a hero emerges, Boris Yeltsin. This is the man who climbed a tank in 1991 and defied the Soviet hardliners. He became Russia's first post-Soviet president. To millions, he is freedom, democracy, and a brand new beginning. Russia finally had hope. But behind the scenes, the country was built on something broken. The Russian state Yeltsin inherits is unstable. The constitution is old, a leftover of the Soviet system. On one side, you have Yeltsin, the powerful new president pushing rapid change. On the other, the old Soviet-era parliament, the Supreme Soviet, led by figures like Ruslan Khasbulatov and Vice President Alexander Rutskoy. They hated Yeltsin's rapid shock therapy economic reforms, and they had the power to block everything he tried to do. It was gridlock from day one, two centers of power, one collapsing nation, and then came the economy. Yeltsin's economic reforms to drag Russia into capitalism were brutal. They called it shock therapy for a reason. Prices exploded overnight, savings evaporated, salaries became useless. While Yeltsin promised a modern future, Parliament blamed him for the fact that millions of Russians suddenly couldn't afford food. They refused to confirm his reform-minded prime minister, demanded control of the central bank, and insisted on checks to the president's power. Russia is no longer arguing about policy, it's arguing about who actually controls the country. For 2 years, it was a legislative street fight. Parliament kept trying to impeach Yeltsin. Yeltsin kept trying to ram through his decrees. It all culminated in the 1993 spring referendum, which Yeltsin actually won. But even that didn't stop the hostility. Both sides were essentially ignoring the constitution, daring the other to make the first truly illegal move. Then, on September 21st, 1993, Yeltsin addressed the nation. He issued Decree number 1400, effectively dissolving parliament and calling for new elections and a new constitution. This was not just controversial, it was illegal under the existing constitution. The response was immediate. On September 23rd, Parliament impeached Yeltsin and named Vice President Alexander Rutskoy acting president, declaring the decree null and void. Russia now had two presidents, two centers of power, and the shadow of civil war hung over Moscow. Tens of thousands of Russians poured into the streets, furious over collapsing living conditions and a future that suddenly felt stolen. By September 28th, the first blood was spilled as riot police clashed with protesters. The Interior Ministry surrounded the parliament with barricades and razor wire. By October 1st, authorities estimated that hundreds of armed fighters had fortified themselves inside the building. Yeltsin's forces encircled it, cutting off electricity, heat, and even phone lines. Russia was no longer just divided politically, it was preparing for war in the middle of its own capital. On the afternoon of October 3rd, everything exploded. Armed anti-Yeltsin forces broke through police lines and seized control of the White House perimeter. At 4 p.m., Yeltsin declared a state of emergency. By evening, rebels had stormed the Moscow mayor's office and marched toward the Ostankino television center to seize the broadcast signal. There, they ran straight into heavily armed police and OMON units. A full-scale gun battle erupted. The TV center was damaged. Broadcasts went dark.
Уважаемые телезрители, в связи с вооруженной осадой телекомпании Останкино, мы вынуждены прервать эфир.
At least 46 people were officially reported dead, including civilians and journalists, though the real number may have been higher. For Yeltsin, this was no longer political protest. It was an armed rebellion. At this stage, the outcome depended entirely on the Russian army. Rutskoy appealed to former colleagues, but most generals hesitated and ultimately sided with Yeltsin. During the night of October 3rd, Yeltsin approved the final plan to retake the parliament. By sunrise on October 4th, the army fully encircled the White House. 10 tanks rolled into position, their cannons aimed at the parliament's upper floors. Moments later, they opened fire. The building erupted in flames. This was a deliberate strategy to create maximum panic and smoke while avoiding total destruction, allowing special forces to storm the perimeter afterward. People across Russia and the world watched it unfold live on national television. Rutskoy's desperate attempts to gain outside military or diplomatic support failed.
Я умоляю боевых товарищей, кто меня слышит, немедленно на помощь к зданию Верховного Совета. Если слышат меня летчики, поднимайте боевые машины.
By mid-afternoon, troops were clearing the White House floor by floor and street resistance was crushed. Kazbulatov and Rudskoy were arrested. What Russians later called the Second October Revolution became the deadliest street fighting Moscow had seen since 1917. Officially, 147 people died, including civilians, soldiers, and law enforcement. Many military leaders who backed Yeltsin would later gain significant political power, including General Pavel Grachev. The United States President Bill Clinton offered Yeltsin full and immediate support. They viewed the parliamentarians as hardline communists and Yeltsin as the only barrier against a return to the Soviet past. In their eyes, a little democracy was sacrificed for what they perceived as stability. Yeltsin didn't waste a minute. In December 1993, he introduced a new constitution by referendum. It granted the president sweeping powers. He could appoint the prime minister even if parliament rejected his choice and dissolve parliament if it resisted him twice. He controlled the military and security institutions, and he could not be impeached for violating the constitution. This wasn't a tweak, this was a fundamental shift. It created the super-presidency that Russia still has today. The shellfire that morning didn't just burn the building. It burned away the chance for a truly balanced Russian democracy.